Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bodleian Libraries. This must certainly be the strangest exhibition open I've ever had to introduce, where over 600 people have come to our private view, but none of you are here in the Bodleian with us this evening. However, it's somewhat fitting that our first exhibition opening for over a year should be held in this hybrid state with a small panel of distinguished guests and visitors who've come to join me in the formal opening of this exhibition, but with the audience, with all of you, wherever you may be across the globe, using the power of the internet to come and join us here in Oxford. Today is a day of great celebration because not only here in the Bodleian are we able to welcome visitors again, but across the university our museums are also welcoming visitors back to physical exhibitions. And it's a great pleasure to think that you tomorrow will be able to come and see our first exhibition for 2021, Roots to Seeds, 400 Years of Oxford Botany, in person. Come and walk around the gallery and then come and have a frothy cappuccino and a slice of cake in the Western Cafe afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, this exhibition also marks two important anniversaries. The founding of the Oxford Botanic Garden, or as it was known at the time, the Oxford Physic Garden, which was opened on the 25th of July, 1621, on a flood-prone meadow leased from Magdalen College. The garden was the stage upon which plant sciences evolved in the university for the next 350 years and counting. Our exhibition, Roots to Seeds, tells the story of 4 centuries of contributions made by researchers and teachers in the university to the global scientific story of plant biology. The founding gift of £5,250 made by the English soldier Sir Henry Danvers, Earl of Danby, and spent on the garden's walls and the muck to improve its soil has proved to be a good investment. This exhibition has been a close collaboration between the Bodleian Libraries, the Department of Plant Sciences, and the Oxford Botanic Garden and Harcourt Arboretum. Each partner has brought something different to the project. The Department of Plant Sciences has supplied the most gifted scholar curator in the form of the Druce Curator of Oxford University Herbaria, Professor Stephen Harris, as well as the incredible collections of plant specimens which you will see in the exhibition. The Bodleian provided the beautiful setting of the Western Library and the St. Lee Gallery to host the exhibition, and expertise from our exhibitions and publishing teams to create the show itself and the accompanying book, Roots to Seeds. Colleagues in our enterprise department have also worked hard to create a new range of botanical-inspired products which, like the exhibition book, are on sale in the shop and, if you will excuse me for the plug, online as well. Just Google Bodleian Shop. Our rare book and manuscript collections in the university also provide some notable exhibition highlights, and you'll see them in the show when you come to visit. And there'll be also a rare opportunity to see one of the university's greatest treasures, those spectacular botanical watercolours which were made by Ferdinand Bauer in the Eastern Mediterranean at the end of the 18th century and finished in Oxford before being published as that great botanical masterpiece, Flora Graeca, one of the most sumptuous botanical books ever made. The third partner in this project has, of course, been the Oxford Botanic Garden and Harcourt Arboretum. Their director, Simon Hiscock, and deputy director, Chris Thorogood, have provided ideas, support, and practical assistance throughout the planning process of the show. The education teams and communication and marketing teams at both the Bodleian and the Botanic Gardens have collaborated fantastically well throughout the project, devising joint campaigns and projects which connect our different audiences during these very challenging times. From a school's poetry project with the Oxford Professor of Poetry, Alice Oswald, to a street art marketing campaign, we found that working in partnership has resulted in a project which we can all be proud of. On this note, I'd like to thank Lauren Baker from the Garden, who worked with current students of plant sciences at Oxford to curate a section of the exhibition which looks to the next 400 years of plant science. The show reveals that the history of botany in Oxford has had periods of relative torpor as well as periods of intense activity. But we also learn that plant sciences here succeeds by focusing on quality research and teaching. It is so encouraging to hear from current students in the Department of Plant Science about how their research will address current and emerging global challenges such as food security and environmental change. Today, the role of plant scientists in society has never been more important. I'd also like to pay particular tribute to Professor Stephen Friend, visiting Professor of Connected Medicine at the Department of Psychiatry, who's generously helped support some of the digital features of the exhibition, such as the audio guide, which will shortly be available. And of course, no exhibition at the Bodleian is possible without our super talented exhibitions team led by Maddie Slaven, who've all worked together throughout the pandemic to prepare this sumptuous exhibition. Finally, thanks to our communications team, to Natalie Audrey and to Steph Spedborough, who supported the virtual opening, and the content of this will be available on our website after this evening. And also thanks to Sarah Jones and to Rosemary Ray, who've managed this event here tonight. Our exhibition opening this evening, ladies and gentlemen, will of course be a mixture of pre-recorded content that we filmed in advance, as well as a live panel discussion and a formal opening itself. And there'll be an opportunity to ask questions during the panel discussion, which will be answered afterwards. But first of all, it's my pleasure to invite you to sit back in your armchair, take a sip of whatever glass you may have in your hand, and enjoy a virtual tour of the exhibition with its curator, Professor Stephen Harris.
My name is Stephen Harris. I am the university's curator of the herbarium, and I'm also the curator of this exhibition. So this exhibition, Roots to Seeds, 400 Years of Botany in Oxford, is essentially a sample of the types of activity that the university has engaged in over the last 400 years from a botanical point of view. And what you'll see in this exhibition is a very wide range of material, from books and manuscripts through to dried specimens, through to three-dimensional models, wood blocks, all sorts of different objects, and all of these objects are linked together by providing us with information about plants and allowing us to study the details of the lives of plants. And so we start off with the origins of botany in Oxford, and that is that's with the Botanic Garden. We then move on to think about the role of botany from in taxonomic research, asking questions about how many species there are, and many of the objects in this collection come from the botanical collections, the herbaria, and those objects have been brought together through the activities of collectors, and it's the activities of collectors in the field that determine the value of these collections for the research that's been conducted upon them. And you will see a few choice items from these collections. The university itself has more than 1 million specimens within the herbarium collections, You'll also see how the specimens and how these objects have been used to gain an understanding of, for example, plant biology, the function of flowers, why, how flowers interact with insects and vice versa. And we also tell the story of how the science of plants has been applied, particularly to forestry and agriculture, and the difficulties that there have been in getting agriculture and forestry accepted as academic subjects within the university. And of course, the plant sciences itself is not only research, it's also about us being able to teach, to get information both to students themselves, but also to be able to disperse that knowledge much more widely. So the objects in this collection, or in the exhibition, tell this story in a series of, essentially a series of snapshots. And the reason for choosing the snapshot approach rather than the chronological approach is because the botanical enterprise that's happened within the university over the last 400 years has not been a continuous one. It's been episodic. There have been periods of intense activity, and then there have been long periods of relatively little activity. So, for example, there was intense activity at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century before the botanical enterprise fizzled out, essentially, until the 1830s, when it was taken up by one of the professors, Charles Daubeny, and during his lifetime, there was this great flourishing of the application of botany, and then it dies again until the 20th century. And of course, at the heart of this has been, for much of this history, has been the Botanic Gardens. And so the Botanic Gardens, established in 1621, botany, understanding of botany accumulated around the Botanic Gardens, but by the end of the 19th century, botany, the science of botany that was happening was it was much too big for the space that was available at the Botanic Gardens. So by the middle of the 20th century, the botany moved its location to its present location on South Parks Road. And so what we need to remember, of course, is that Oxford doesn't act alone in this enterprise of trying to understand how plants work and the science of plants. It's part of this international network, and that's become increasingly important with the over the last certainly over the last 50 years, and certainly that will be the case into the future. The science that we do now on plants is very different to the science that was being done 400 years ago. But the types of questions are very similar, along the lines of, well, what species is this? Where does this species grow? How does this species grow? How can we use these species in order to be able to tackle problems such as associated with environmental change, associated with trying to feed our wider populations?
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that tour of the treasures of Oxford's scientific collections. And it's now my great pleasure indeed to welcome you to the formal opening of this exhibition by one of the treasures of British science, Sir Paul Nurse. Paul Nurse is a geneticist and cell biologist whose discoveries have helped to explain how the cell controls its cycle of growth and division. Working in fission yeast, he showed that the CDC2 gene encodes a protein kinase which ensures the cell is ready to copy its DNA and divide. His findings are broader significance since errors in cell growth and division may lead to cancer and other serious diseases. Paul was educated at the University of Birmingham and did his doctoral work at the University of East Anglia. He spent his early career in the universities of Edinburgh and here at the University of Oxford. But his contributions to cell biology and cancer research were recognised with a knighthood in 1999, and his endeavours relating to the discovery of the cell cycle regulatory molecules saw him jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 2001. Over the last 30 years, he has held many senior research leadership roles in British and international science. In 2010, he was elected as President of the Royal Society, and since 2011, he's been Director and Chief Executive of the Francis Crick Institute, one of the world's leading biomedical research institutes, which opened in that year. Ladies and gentlemen, you can't join me in clapping here in the Western Library, but wherever you are, please put your hands together and welcome Sir Paul Nurse.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Three things I really like: Botanic Gardens, books, and the Bodleian. And they've all come together in this exhibition. And I'm so delighted to be here at its opening. The exhibition, as you've heard, celebrates Oxford University's Botanic Gardens, all 400 years of it. Now, that's an important anniversary. But the exhibition celebrates more than even this memorable occasion, because it also celebrates, more generally, the value of Botanic Gardens as places of research and scholarship, of contemplation and pleasure, places that bring you closer to the natural world. They are marks of civilization and of culture. Roots to Seeds records all of this through the exhibition and the book of the same name, both beautifully curated by Stephen Harris, who you've just seen, Druce Curator of Herbaria in Plant Sciences here at the university. Stephen takes us on a journey through the history of the gardens and the arboretum and of the Department of Plant Sciences. He introduces us to the characters involved, what they did, and sometimes what they did not do, the structures they put in place, the science they carried out. He tells us stories about collecting, classifying, experimenting, and using plants. I have an example here of the use of plants. This is a bottle of gin made in Oxford, branded by the Oxford Botanic Garden Physic Gin. I strongly recommend it to you all. These stories that he tells, they're all wrapped up in the distinguished and beautiful tradition of botanical illustration, linking art and the plant world, both in the book and in the exhibition. Let me take you back 400 years to the year 1621, the 25th of July. A group of Oxford academics, led by the Vice-Chancellor, processed, as so often is the case in Oxford, processed from St Mary's Church in the High Street to a meadow owned by Magdalen College next to the River Cherwell. They were founding the Oxford University Botanic Garden. the first in these aisles. The meadow was leased from the college, walls were put up, and after a while, plants began to arrive. The gardens were born. Now, in the 17th century, as you've heard, such gardens were gardens of physic, closely linked to medicine, through the apothecaries preparing medicines and drugs derived from those plants, the forerunners, of course, of the modern pharmaceutical industry. It was the time of the great herbals, such as Gerard's herbal, that you will find in the exhibition. As time moved on, botanic gardens developed new scientific interests. They helped to put order in the natural world, the natural living world, to identify plants and classify them, not only to name them, but also to describe how the different plants related one to another. They drove the new discipline of taxonomy. And plants more generally became tools to understand biology. It was here in Oxford that Robert Hooke took a razor and cut a thin slice of a plant and looked at it through the newly invented microscope. And what he saw was orderly boxes of orderly boxes he called cells. He had discovered the basic structural and functional unit of all life, the cell. Go to the high street and you will see his plaque on the wall there commemorating his discovery. In the early 1980s, in the middle of the Cold War, I went to another garden, a garden of Brno Monastery in the then Czechoslovakia, where the monk Grigor Mendel in the 1860s had crossed pea plants together and gathered the first evidence for the existence of genes, the basis of heredity in all living things, from viruses to human beings. Plants and gardens have greatly contributed to some of the most fundamental discoveries in science. But back to the Oxford Botanic Garden. As well as plants, the garden cultivated explorer botanists, hardy collectors. Roaming the jungles, the steppes, the mountains of the world, they revealed the extraordinary diversity of plant life throughout the globe. Plants were sent back to Oxford, swelling the collections in the herbarium at the university. Study of this diversity of life helped Charles Darwin formulate his great theory of evolution by natural selection. In the 20th century, ecology came to the fore in the plant sciences at Oxford, research that focused on the deep interactions between plants and fungi, and with animal life. Through knowledge of these interactions, it has become increasingly clear how humanity is so dependent upon plant life, and therefore how important it is to preserve biodiversity. A new role emerged for the Oxford Garden to stress the importance of conservation of individual species and habitats, and to play a practical role in conservation, for example, in endangered native flora. So the Oxford Botanic Garden is a place of research and scholarship. But as I said at the beginning, it is also a place of contemplation and of pleasure, somewhere you can be at peace. Even the worldly Voltaire got his character Candide to say, after his extraordinary travels and adventures across the globe, that we all need to cultivate our gardens. I come to the Oxford Botanic Garden to admire nature and the plant world, and also to be at peace, to think, to contemplate. It's a balm to be there. It puts the troubles of the world in perspective. Botanic gardens are increasingly important for our mental well-being. Appropriately, for this exhibition and book. There are connections between gardens and libraries. They are both places for contemplation, one through the wonder of the natural world and the other through the knowledge gathered by humanity over the centuries. The importance of libraries as repositories of knowledge is the central theme of Richard's recent book, Burning the Books. I sometimes think that we should demand our political leaders to spend 1 week a year in a botanic garden, considering the natural world, and another week in a great library, such as the one here, the Bodleian, considering humanity's achievements and civilization. This way, our leaders might get a better perspective of the world, rediscover their moral compass, which seems to so often go awry for them. Gardens and libraries are both catalysts for a better world. With that whimsical thought, which I unfortunately do not think will be delivered, I will end this talk by congratulating the Oxford University Botanic Garden and Arboretum, the Department of Plant Sciences, the Bodleian Library, and Stephen Harris in particular, for this exhibition and for the book. So on behalf of my colleagues here, we declare Roots to Seeds open. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please now enjoy a discussion of the catalogue to this exhibition between Professor Stephen Harris and Dr. Samuel Fanous, Head of Publishing for the Bodleian Libraries.
Hello, I'm Samuel Fanous, Head of Publishing at the Bodleian Library, and I'm here with Professor Stephen Harris to discuss his most recent book, Roots to Seeds, 400 Years of Oxford Botany, which is the title of the exhibition opening today. Stephen, thank you for speaking with me about your book.
Thank you.
We think of modern botanical research as something that involves DNA and genetics. Yet in your book, you place significant emphasis on the continuing role of preserved plants, some centuries old. What use are dead plants, especially those that have been dead for a very long time, in modern botanical research?
So a specimen, a dead plant, allows us to know what people were working on in the past, what their concept was of a particular species, and allows us to compare work that went on with the past with modern work. And of course, the dead specimens that you talk about, we can get DNA out of these. We can actually get the genetic material out of them. We can get chemical materials out of them. And those dead plants also allow us to look back in time at changes that may have happened to, for example, distributions of plants, the appearances of plants. So these specimens, they have a huge power to inform modern botany, plant sciences. But of course, you know, they are just part of the whole way of obtaining information about plants. They're not the be all the end all. They are one facet of that enterprise of trying to understand the biology of plants.
And why is it useful for us to know what people were working on in the past?
Well, for example, let's say the Botanic Gardens. The Botanic Gardens published a catalogue in 1648. It's got a list of names in it. And that list of names is just a list of names. It's very difficult to really know what they were without reference to a physical specimen, which we can look at now and say, right, that's what they meant by that particular name. So they are evidence. They are data points that allow us to understand what's going on.
How would you characterize Oxford's contribution to the study of botany worldwide? If, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, 400 years in a nutshell. I think that's actually a very difficult thing, a very difficult thing to do, because one is often looking at particular points in time and saying, well, what was that contribution in particular points in time? It's not continuous. One of the things about botany in Oxford is that it's been very patchy. There have been some periods of enormous activity, and then there have been these long periods of relative inactivity. So very early on, the work that was going on in terms of trying to classify plants, the work of Robert Morrison in putting together the first monograph in the 1680s is an important milestone. The work of the first Sherardian professor, Johann de Lennius, on the taxonomy and of the lower plants, the mosses, the lichens, these sorts of things, is also an important point as well. There've been periods of exploration which have contributed knowledge, and then there was this, and then again the periods of reawakening under Daubney, where we have interests in integrating essentially chemistry and geology into botany comes forward, and then of course and then there's all the revolutions that are associated with genetics and evolutionary biology stimulated by Darwin from the during the 20th century.
You mention in your book the enormous wealth that came from plants in the past and their relative socio-economic value. In our modern technological age, has the role of plants perhaps decreased somewhat?
No, I absolutely don't think they have. We wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for plants. Plants are fundamental to our lives. They provide the oxygen that we breathe, and however technological we become, we're still going to need an oxygen supply. They are food. They are means of providing clean water. They are construction materials. They're sources of medicine. There's all sorts of things that plants have done in the past, and they continue to do. We may feel that we're rather remote from plants, but you just need to think about it for a little, and you suddenly realize that that's not the case. All of our fossil fuels ultimately came from plants.
Our coffee.
And our coffee, tea, everything that all of these things that we greatly value are associated with plants. The fact that we don't seem to see them, or we have this blindness for them, doesn't negate the fact that they are absolutely fundamental to our lives, and also to the solutions of some of the big problems that we're facing, associated with environmental change, associated with food production, for example.
Yes, of course, of course. The Botanic Garden in Oxford was founded as a physic garden, with a remit to teach physicians about the value and the role of medicinal plants. How has the use of the Botanic Garden changed over the centuries?
You're quite right. The original Botanic Gardens was conceived as a physic garden. It's clear, though, that if you look at the information that's available, that it very soon shifted away from that. It became more of what we might think of as a garden associated with trying to understand the biology of plants in modern terms, and over the time, there have been periods where it's focused on trying to understand systematics, these types of things. In other periods, it's been more of a pleasure garden, a recreational space. It's been a space to show off, essentially. At other times, it's drifted in the sense that it's become. People have not been that interested in it, and everything. And in terms of the modern garden, then the focus is on issues around plant conservation, education, about plant diversity, these sorts of things.
And is that the role that it has in teaching and research today?
Yes. So there is a teaching role in the gardens. Everything from school children up all the way up through the university and beyond. And in terms of the research, then the research activity is now directed by the senior staff within the Botanic Garden.
And what can you characterize the kind of research that's being done in the garden today? Again, just in general terms.
I think
give us a sense of that.
I think the best person to talk to is obviously the director of the gardens, rather than myself. But they are certainly they're certainly working on trying to understand plant speciation. They're trying to understand the biology of insectivorous plants. These sorts of things.
It's interesting that that takes place side by side with the fact that the Botanic Gardens are public space and open to visitors, to residents of Oxford and visitors from around the world.
Yes, and of course, that's not always been the case. For most of its history, the Botanic Gardens has been a private space for the university.
Long may it continue as such. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stephen,
Thank you
for talking with me today. And Stephen's book, Roots to Seeds, 400 Years of Oxford Botany, is published today, and it's available from the Bodleian Shop on Broad Street and online at www.bodleianshop.co.uk. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce our very distinguished panel this evening, who are going to take the next part of this evening. After that pre-recorded event, we have a live discussion with four very distinguished participants. The first of those I've already introduced, Paul Nurse, but he's joined by Professor Stephen Harris, the Druce Curator of Herbaria and Associate Professor in the Department of Plant Sciences, who of course you've already heard from this evening. And he's also joined most appropriately this evening by Professor Simon Hiscock, Director of the Oxford University Botanic Garden and Harcourt Arboretum. And Simon is a distinguished researcher in his own right, but came to join Oxford, having been Director of the Botanic Garden at the University of Bristol in 2014. And Simon is in fact an alumnus of Oxford University, both in his undergraduate and graduate work, and is currently a student of Christ Church here. They are chaired this evening, ladies and gentlemen, by Dinah Rose QC. Dinah read modern history at Magdalen College here in Oxford, and then took the postgraduate diploma in law and qualified as a barrister. After practicing at the bar for 30 years as a distinguished member of Blackstone Chambers, specialising in human rights, public law and competition law, she came back to Oxford, to her old college, as president of Magdalen in September 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to put questions to the panel into the chat line on YouTube, but it's my pleasure now to hand over to the president of Magdalen, Dinah Rose.
Thank you very much, Richard. Simon, congratulations on being the director of the Botanic Garden in its 400th anniversary year. That's quite an exciting prospect, although, of course, some of your celebrations have sadly fallen victim to COVID. I had the great pleasure of a tour from you of the garden, and it is a beautiful and inspiring space. But what does it mean to you, the history of the garden and its role now? What does it really mean to you as its director?
Well, it means a great deal, Dinah, and you'll have heard where it all started, and we're celebrating 400 years. It was founded in 1621 when Henry Danvers, 1st Earl of Danby, took out a lease of 5 acres from your college on behalf of the university to found the physic garden for the teaching of how to tell the difference between different medicinal plants to medical students here at Oxford. And you'll be pleased to hear that 400 years later, we haven't missed a rental payment yet.
So, I'm told I'm supposed to get paid in exotic fruit, is that right?
Yes, we've been a little bit neglectful of that, I must say, but we will furnish you with some exotic fruits from the glass houses this year. You have my word. So the garden, as we've heard, was a physic garden for many years, and then it became known as the Botanic Garden when Professor Charles Daubney changed its name in the 1830s to reflect the experimental botanical science that he was doing and championing. And then there were other additions to the garden subsequently. In 1946, the garden leased a further 3 acres from Christchurch, and that area is to the south of the garden as we see it today, below the historic walled garden, which was the physic garden, and that abuts Christchurch Meadow, and we generally refer to that as the lower garden. But then, importantly, in 1963, the Arboretum at Newnham Estate, which the university owned, was given over to the Botanic Garden to manage, and that began with a 8-acre pinetum, and that has expanded over the years so that today we have an arboretum of 130 acres. So on this Botanic Garden and Arboretum estate, we cultivate in the region of 5,000 different kinds of plants. And this living collection, this living biodiverse collection, is the heart of everything we do strategically at the Botanic Garden in terms of research, education, conservation, and importantly, public engagement. We're a public-facing part of the university, and that's very important at communicating messages to people about plants, particularly this notion that people don't think plants are particularly important, something that social scientists have called plant blindness. So we're giving out messages to the public, to schools, that plants matter, plants are important, and hopefully curing some of this plant blindness.
So you have a powerful mission in terms of communication and education of the public on plants. But where does the garden fit in now in research terms?
Well, we've got since I started in 2015, we've put a clear focus on establishing a portfolio of collections-based research using the garden. We don't have any labs there ourselves, so we work with plant scientists in the Department of Plant Sciences, and that's where I share a lab with others. But we're not only working with plant scientists at Oxford and elsewhere, but we're working with chemists, engineers, mathematicians, and medics in the university on a number of other products.
Where does engineering fit in with
Engineering is around an emerging subject in research of biomimetics, where engineers and mathematicians and physicists look to solve let's say, structural problems, chemical problems, by looking at how plants do that, do particular functions, how they've evolved to do things. So Dr. Chris Thorogood is working with engineers and mathematicians on how the giant Amazonian water lily is supported so efficiently. And that has revealed some exciting mechanical and mathematical rules for how that leaf, in terms of its venation, is such an effective support floating system in the Amazon. And there are potential applied effects at designing floating offshore energy producing structures for the future.
Amazing. And in the garden itself, do you have any favourite specimens? Are there any plants that you have a particular soft spot for?
I ought to say the plant that I've worked on for many, many years, work that started here in Oxford and then continued at Bristol and come back to Oxford, which is on the biology, the reproductive biology and evolution of the eponymous Oxford ragwort and its relatives on Mount Etna in Sicily. So. And I think it's a beautiful plant. People have a lot of misgivings about ragworts, but that's the native ragwort that is the scourge of pony meadows. But the Oxford ragwort is a rather beautiful plant and was cultivated as an ornamental at the Botanic Garden and at other gardens around the country.
On a slightly different scale, you showed me in the garden a living fossil.
Yes, we have a number of living fossils.
It was a mighty tree.
Yes, Dawn redwood, a metasequoia that was known in the fossil record for many, many years, but was discovered still living in a part of China in 1946, and we have one of the first specimens that was grown in the UK, planted in 1949.
It's already huge.
It's huge, yeah, they grow remarkably quickly. And last year I was lucky enough to meet the son of the superintendent that planted that very tree when he came back in his 90s to visit the garden, and he told me how he remembered planting that tree with his father, George Robinson.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Stephen, can I turn to you now? You've referred to the fact that the history of botany in Oxford has been a little bit patchy. That there have been some periods where it hasn't been quite as good as other periods. What sort of period are we in now? Is this a period of intense activity or a period of relative dormancy?
This is a period of absolutely great activity. There's fantastic things going on in plant sciences now. It's probably stronger now than it's ever been.
And what do you see as the main themes that are being explored by plant sciences in Oxford at the moment?
So main themes are along the lines of systematics. We're talking about developmental biology, plant biochemistry, plant cell biology. There's a whole range of different things going on, often associated with dealing with practical issues. For example, feeding people, all of these sorts of things. So there's a lot of activity going on. It's a very strong subject.
And do you find that the people researching those areas are coming to you they want to look at your extraordinary specimens,
So it depends on the subject area. So obviously, people who are working in systematics are wanting to know what species are, wanting to know whether they've got new species, then they will come to our collections. And it's not just people in Oxford that are doing this, it's people from all over the world that are doing this. So we are part of an international collection of herbaria that are linked. We exchange specimens, we exchange information. So there's periods of people coming from all over the place to use the collections.
We did a tour of the exhibition, your exhibition, before this evening, and it is an absolutely fascinating exhibition and also remarkably beautiful. There's an amazing convergence between the science and real aesthetic pleasure. I mean, obviously the watercolors are exquisite, but also these amazing teaching models. Can you tell me a bit about those?
Absolutely. So these teaching models were put together in France, and mainly in France and Germany in the late 19th century, and this was in the period when people started. There was a much greater engagement with public education. So before that period, people had a tendency just to hand round a few diagrams among a small number of students, but the numbers of students increased, and obviously you can't really do that with a very large number of students. And the other thing, of course, with these three-dimensional models, which are hugely sort of magnified flowers, they allow you to look at the relationships between the different parts, and of course that can't be done in many cases because these plants are only, or the living plants are only available for a short period of time. So with the best will in the world, you're never going to get these plants growing in the gardens throughout the year. So they're available fresh for a limited amount of time, but these models give people the opportunity to look at these things in magnified form throughout the year.
It's also wonderful to see in the exhibition the dried flowers and plants going back hundreds of years, all beautifully preserved. But I think that the oldest specimen in the exhibition is rather older even than the oldest dried flowers. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So the oldest object the oldest object in the collection is a slide of a fossil 300 million years old. And it's there because it contains a dividing root tip. And in fact the only one that's known in the world, and the other reason for having it there is to show that collections change over time. So that particular object came into the collections in the late 19th century, and then was largely forgotten about and ignored, and then in the 21st century suddenly the technologies change, the way that people look at these things change, and there's a whole range of different new questions being asked, and suddenly these objects can take on a whole new life, and that's true of any of the objects in the collections. So we can never predict how they're going to be used.
Is it right that you rescued this root tip from a skip?
Well, yes, yes. But we won't go into that.
Thank you very, very much. And do you have a favourite plant?
Do I have a favourite plant?
Yeah.
Difficult one. I like so many different sorts of plants, but I'm particularly fond of members of the daisy family. Same family, in fact, as the Oxford ragwort.
Is it right that your D.Phil was on the Oxford ragwort?
Yes.
And so there's a strong constituency here voting for the Oxford ragwort.
Collaborated on a number of research projects over the years, not surprisingly.
Paul, thank you so much for your wonderful talk earlier. I love the idea of our leaders being required to spend time in gardens and in the Bodleian. I'm sure we'd be in a much better state if only they heeded your advice. Of course, your own particular interest is in the study of cells and molecular biology. Where do plants fit in to our understanding of the fundamentals of biology?
Do you know, plants have a really important role in some of the most fundamental ideas of biology. I'm not even sure it's fully recognized, to be quite honest. I mentioned two of them in my talk, and I'm just going to say a little bit more about them. The first is the cell, as you've just mentioned, and that is the fundamental unit of life. It's a fundamental structural unit, but also functional unit, and it was discovered in a plant, Robert Hooke, here in Oxford. And not only that, but actually the evidence built up around cells also came from plants. So in the exhibition, you'll see a book from Nehemiah Grew, who was the first plant anatomist who really took it seriously, I think you would say, Stephen. And they are amazing pictures. In fact, we don't have a picture on, we have to turn a page over to show what they are. They are absolutely extraordinary, showing the diversity of cells, the different shapes and everything. And this was the beginning of the cell as I call it life's atom, because it's like the sort of that basic unit. It took 130 years or more before it was fully accepted, because they're much more difficult to see in animals than they were in plants. But a critical, important discovery. The second one, discovery of the gene. I mentioned Grigor Mendel, pea plants in that monastery in Brno. When I was there, I was in my late 20s, in the middle of winter, looking at where his greenhouse stood, where his garden was. He had a gigantic greenhouse. I had no idea why the monks were doing scientific research, but they were. And he did these crosses. He was trained as a physicist, actually. So unlike perhaps most naturalists of the time who described things, he counted them very clearly as well. And out of counting them, he realized that there were certain ratios emerged, and that led to the idea that there were particles. There was a particular theory of heredity, and that was the basis of the gene. Really, really important stuff, totally ignored. Published it in 1865. I read about it in the Encyclopedia Britannica in the 1880s. Nobody took any notice of what he was really saying. Rediscovered by 3 more botanists in the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, and who confirmed, and indeed what we now call Mendelian genetics, the discovery of the gene, also from plants. Third one, which I didn't mention, and it's about a fungus, which we sort of think of as a plant, but actually, well, I might say something about that a little bit at the end. It's a bit more complicated than that. And this is that life can be understood in terms of chemistry. And this has its origins in fermentation, the making of alcohol, actually. And Louis Pasteur, in particular, not just Pasteur, but also, in fact, Lavoisier before him. And what Pasteur was doing, he was studying in northern France why sugar beet fermentations went wrong sometimes. Sugar beet fermentation was used to make alcohol, but sometimes it made acid. And the industrialists didn't like that because they had to throw away the fermentation. So he examined this, he investigated it. It was an applied project. Looked down with another microscope and saw that in the good fermentations that made alcohol, he saw yeast, a fungus. In the bad ones, he saw bacteria, and they made acid. So he just said to the industrialists, put yeast in there and it'll work. But he did more than that. What he did is he also said, well, what does this mean? This means that chemical transformations are linked with life, with these cells. And so then he made the general conclusion, which is that we could understand life through study of cells in terms of chemistry. And that was really the birth of biochemistry. So 3 major discoveries of the life sciences, all made in plants. I think we really have to celebrate plant and plant scientists. I mean, made fantastic contributions.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. And do you have a favourite plant, and is it the ragwort?
It's not a ragwort, so I'm standing out. But it is yellow, and I just like the simple primrose. It's early on, spring, makes you feel cheerful. Charles Darwin wrote a lot about it, and it's just nice, isn't it?
It is. It's a beautiful plant. Thank you. I want to come back to you, Simon, to talk about the future. What do you see as being the real opportunities for the Botanic Garden now for the next 5, 10, 15 years? Where are you going in the garden?
There are plenty of opportunities, Dinah. I think we're at a very exciting point in the Botanic Garden's history. As we emerge from the pandemic, we've seen how important plants, green spaces, the natural world is for people's health and well-being. And whilst we've been open during the last couple of lockdowns following government guidance, we've seen numbers increase at the garden, but also importantly at the Arboretum. It's almost as though people have discovered it, and people actually cried to come back into the garden again at the end of the first lockdown. And there are clearly benefits to people's mental health, well-being, through visiting gardens, open spaces. And the exciting thing is that we're going to try and assess and experimentally analyse these benefits with the Department of Psychiatry and John Geddes. So we're looking forward to this new opportunity in research that in effect goes full circle. 400 years later, the garden founded as a part of the medical school physics. Now, 400 years later, there's an opportunity to go back into medical research. So I find that
So it's
very,
a physic garden in a different way.
Yes.
That actually
spiritual.
ties in with one of the questions that we've had from the audience while we've been having this discussion, who've asked the question, do medical students still make use of the Botanic Garden and carry out research there? And I guess that's the answer to that question.
Well, it will certainly.
There's going to be a research project on the psychological
It's going
benefits.
to be built, this will be built in as a part of a wider gardens, libraries and museums research with Professor Geddes, head of the psychiatry department, to look at the benefits to people's mental health and well-being of collections, not just gardens. So that will be very exciting.
And is it right that you have some ambitions to build?
Yes, we've got two very challenging and important capital projects that need to be delivered over the next few years. First of all, the glass houses at the Botanic Garden are in a very poor condition and need replacing to make sure we can secure the future of our wonderful plant collections. And also we need to open up the Arboretum with more visitor and education space. So we have a National Lottery Heritage Fund application in at the moment for a visitor centre and education centre at the Arboretum. So two very exciting and important capital projects.
You told me you want to have a rainforest.
Yes, that's our hook, really. We want to create a tropical rainforest in the centre of Oxford for telling stories about why plants matter and why biodiversity matters and why we must conserve it to address global challenges.
The next question I've got here from the audience, I think, is probably an indication of the time of day we're having this talk. How did the Oxford Botanic Gin come about? What inspired its flavours and botanicals? Can you tell us?
Yes, I can certainly do that. And thank you, Paul,
Perhaps Paul could wave the bottle
for flagging that.
It's looking increasingly tempting.
You can find the inspiration for this in the exhibition. A little book that is the first list of plants cultivated in the Physic Garden, published in 1648. And of the 25 botanicals that go into the gin, 24 of them are listed in that book. And we also harvest about 12 to 15 botanicals from the garden. And it's made by local distillery, the Oxford Artisan Distillery.
Maybe you could throw some of that in with the exotic fruit. That would be quite good.
I will.
Next question is for Stephen. Congratulations, you've given an inspiring account of the current living and herbarium collections. What of the future? Will it be more of the same? What's the future for the herbaria?
So the future for the herbarium is obviously we're going to it will continue to expand. Large parts of the collection are going to be digitized. We're going through digitization programs at the moment, trying to get more of this material actually available online so people can actually look at it, use it in their own ways. And of course in a few years' time we're going to be moving into new space within the New Life and Life Sciences building that's being erected. So that's all really positive. And
the next question, which I guess is for both of you, is about how the research that's being done in Oxford, particularly at the Botanic Garden, how does that link up with research elsewhere in the world? And how does the diversity of our collections compare with our international colleagues?
Well, speaking from the work that I do and we do at the Garden in terms of research, we collaborate widely. So I have collaborations in Italy to do with the origin of the Oxford ragwort, in Sicily at the University of Catania and in Naples, and my colleague Chris Thorogood is collaborating with researchers in Malaysia, in the Canary Islands on work that he's doing. So we've got international as well as national collaborations, so it fits well. We don't obviously have as many different plants as, for instance, Kew and some of the other larger botanic gardens, but we like to think we punch above our weight, so to speak.
Interesting question here about botanical illustrations. They're one of the wonderful features of this exhibition, the absolutely stunning watercolours and the botanical drawings. Do you think that the improved quality of digital photography is going to lessen the importance of botanical illustration in the future, Stephen?
No, I don't think it will. I think digital photography and botanical illustration are different things. They complement each other. So I think there are things that you can do with botanical illustration which are very difficult to do with digital photography, and vice versa. And there's if you look over the history of botanical illustration, there's always been this this thing about making sure that botanical illustration is about producing something that's aesthetically pleasing, but also is scientifically useful. And that's one of the important things that the illustrations themselves actually have a role within science. They are essentially data which can then be interpreted. And of course, digital photography can do the same type of thing, but it does it in a different way. And I think at the moment we're in an interesting position of trying to almost work out where those complementarities actually are. So, what things botanical illustration is really good for, what things are digital photography really good for, and where do they meet up? So it's not a case of just tossing out botanical illustration because digital photography has come along.
And question about the fabric of the garden, Simon. Can you tell us something about the 19th century garden ornaments in the garden?
We don't have all of them now. I think Stephen's historical knowledge on this might be deferred to here. The wild boar has disappeared, hasn't it?
Yeah, the wild boars.
Hang on, wait a minute.
We had a statue of a wild boar. I think there's a copy of it in the Ashmolean.
Yes, I think there is.
What's happened to the wild boar?
What happened to it, Stephen?
I'm not sure. I think it was removed.
Yes,
because it didn't fit with the overall design of the garden.
But we don't know where it went.
I can't remember where it went off the top of my head.
No.
And what other sorts of ornaments?
We've got a wonderful stone urn at the bottom of the garden in the lower garden, which is magnificent. Mm-hmm. That's the main piece that we have left. There are some other stone urns which are not of such quality.
The other thing that's really striking is the entrance gate.
Yes.
It was absolutely beautiful.
Well, that is to commemorate the founder, Henry Danvers, hence we call it the Danby Gate, mm-hmm. First Earl of Danby. And
what date is that? Is that contemporaneous with the opening of the garden?
That was built during the 1620s. I think it was finished in 1630.
It was finished in 1632.
32, along with the wall. So the basically, the garden was founded on the 25th of July, 1621. The Vice-Chancellor laid a stone there, and then that set off the building, well, the raising of the land, because we're on a floodplain,
and
so all
muck.
those 4,000 wagon loads of muck and dung and everything. And then the wall was built with the 4 gates, including the memorial gate to Danvers, which was built by Nicholas Stone, the master sculptor of Inigo Jones.
And final question for all 3 of you. Can I start with you, Paul? Do you have a favourite item in this exhibition, and what is it?
Well, I do like the 17th century books, and they have a first edition of Gerard's Herbal there from 1596, if I remember rightly, and I mean, that's magnificent. And I'm back to Nehemiah Grew again. He's just so extraordinary what he produced, and it just makes my heart ache actually to think of these scientists so many years ago, and you feel this empathy with them, what they're seeing, what they're doing, and there's this continuum of science from right back there 350 years ago in that case to now, and you just feel you're like them. I think that's what probably turned
Stephen,
me on.
That's wonderful. And Stephen, what about you?
What about me?
Well, they're all your babies, of course.
They're all my babies.
You've got to choose a favourite child.
I think the object that's there in terms of it, essentially starting the whole thing off, certainly from the herbarium point of view, is the Bobart the Elder herbarium, the great big book herbarium, which dates from about the 1660s and was returned to us, having been loaned probably at the beginning of the 18th century. It was returned to us in the early 1950s.
So hang on, it was loaned in the early 18th century and came back in the 1950s?
Yep.
And no one knew where it was in the intervening period?
Yep.
How did you get it back?
A medical library, Bedford Royal Infirmary Medical Library was closing. Everything was being dispersed. Somebody at the Linnaean, in fact the librarian at the Linnaean Society, recognised the handwriting of Jacob Bobart the Elder, who was the first keeper of the garden, and it came back.
That's amazing, fantastic. And how about you, Simon?
Well, of all the objects, it has to be the Flora Graeca. But I think that one of the highlights, if not the highlight of the exhibition, is the contribution made by the young plant sciences students as to why they are interested in plants and want to study plants. And they're the future, and they're looking forward to the future. And I think that's a great uplifting way to end the exhibition as you walk out.
Thank you so much, but I might fight you for the Flora Graeca. Thank you all so much. I'm going to hand back now to Richard to close the evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening for the opening of Roots to Seeds. It's such a shame that you haven't been able to be with us here in the Bodleian with a glass of something or other in your hand, having convivial company with our distinguished guests and with each other. But from tomorrow, you can come here and see the exhibition yourselves in a socially distanced, very safe way to do that. And I urge you to come and enjoy this spectacular celebration of botanical science and of the botanical garden here in Oxford University. Not only should you come at your earliest opportunity to see the show, but when you do, please ensure that you walk down the High Street and visit the Botanic Garden itself in this most special 400th anniversary year. No visit to Oxford ever is complete without visiting the garden. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for coming, and please, wherever you are across the globe, put your hands together and thank our distinguished guests, our distinguished panel, and the wonderful exhibition that we have just celebrated its opening tonight.